Hey there, welcome back to NRW. I'm your host today, Rob, the movie guy, and I thank you very much for joining me here today. And as you can tell from the intro, I'm reviewing the latest Amazon original film and Coming to America. And this was a movie I did catch earlier today, and I can truthfully say that I did enjoy the film pretty much a great deal. But there is no doubt in my mind that the original Coming to America is the better film of the two. But when you compare this movie, say, to the Dumb and Dumber 2 film and even Zoolander number 2, which were coming off of really popular first films, both films that were very successful, this movie is like The Godfather Part 2 in comparison to those sequels, because I think that the story was much better structured and the characters were a little better developed and they had a lot more interesting, engaging things for you to connect with, at least for me personally, than you would in these other two films. And John Landis, who had directed the first film, is not back this time around to direct this movie. Instead, we get the director in Craig Brewer, who had actually worked with Eddie Murphy prior to this film in the wonderful Netflix original movie, And Dolomite Is My Name. And if you have not seen that film, I recommend you go out of your way to check out that movie, because that is a very surprisingly good film. And he had also done another movie that I think is very good in Hustle and Flow, starring Terrence Howard. If you have not seen that film, I recommend you also check that film as well. But I was looking forward to see what he was going to do with this film after watching Dolomite Is My Name. And truthfully, I think he did a really good job, considering that he must have been under a lot of pressure to direct a film that is a sequel to, is to be considered one of the greatest comedies of all time. And I think he did a really good job with that. As I said before, this movie is not bad at all. It's a pretty good film, and I think he did a good job with the directing side of it here. Now, I will warn anybody out there who has not seen the movie, I will be getting into some spoiler territory here, because in order for me to really delve into the plot and tell you what I like about the film and what I didn't like about the movie, I will be getting into that spoiler territory. So if you've not seen the film and don't want to get spoiled, I recommend you pause the video right now, check out the film on Amazon, and then come on back to this review. So the film picks up 30 years after the events of the first film, and through a family witch doctor played by Arsenio Hall, he has a vision where he discovers that Akeem has an illegitimate son still out in Queens, New York, and Akeem never knew he had this son, and he does inform Akeem and his father that he has to go to New York, pick up his son, and then bring him back to Zamunda, because according to Zamunda law, only a male heir can inherit the throne, and given that Akeem only has 3 daughters, it is very important for him to carry that traditional law. And Akeem does become the king of Zamunda after his father passes away, but shortly afterwards, Akeem runs into a problem when he gets a visit from a dictator from a neighboring nation called Nextdoria, played by the wonderful Wesley Snipes, who plays the character of General Izzy. And General Izzy threatens Akeem with a violent takeover of Zamunda if Akeem does not have his oldest daughter marry his son. But when Izzy discovers that Akeem does have a son out in New York, he tells him, well, I have a daughter, and you can have your son marry my daughter, and we can unite the two nations together, or else. And now with that extra incentive, Akeem does go back to New York to go look for his son, and when he does encounter his son, it takes some convincing for him to have his son to go back with him to Zamunda, which his son eventually agrees to, only if his mother can go along with them, and Akeem has no choice but to agree to this. And then when they do land in Zamunda, Akeem tells his son that he has to go through a series of tests first in order for him to qualify as a prince before he can become the official heir of the throne to Zamunda. And Akeem's oldest daughter, Princess Mika, who's supposed to be the next in line to become the ruler of Zamunda after her father, realizes that she does have a brother that she was unaware of, and now he's going to be skipping over her to become the next ruler after her father. So this obviously pisses her off and creates a problem within the family. So to make a long story short, Akeem's son, who goes by the name of Lavelle in the film, does pass all the tests that's required for him to become an official prince of Zamunda, but along the way he falls in love with the royal groomer of the palace and decides he's not going to marry General Izzy's daughter, which obviously caused some problems, and some altercation occurs along the way, which then eventually gets settled through. And then Akeem realizes that he should not force his son to do something that he doesn't want to do, and allow his son to make the decisions for himself for what's best for him, and then comes to realize that his daughter, who is training her entire life to become the next ruler of Zamunda after her father, is in fact the rightful heir to the throne, and decides he's going to make some changes with the laws so that way all the restrictions that were in place before are now lifted for everyone to have more liberties, especially the women in Zamunda, to do as they please, so long as they're not hurting anybody else. And then there's a happy ending where people reunite and you see some familiar faces. And that is pretty much the end of the film right there in a nutshell. There's a lot of things I did leave out because it's going to take too long for me to get into all the details as far as what goes on to the film. So Now that we got that out of the way, I'm going to go into get into my positives, and then I'm going to be getting into my negatives. The first positive I want to point out is something that I had mentioned at the beginning of this review, which is that I did enjoy the film a great deal. There was a lot of things about this movie that I did like, especially with the comedy, because I did have quite a few laughs with this movie. And the overall story itself, I thought was actually worked well for the film. And a lot of the characters I also liked in the movie as well. And as I mentioned earlier, that you do see a lot of familiar faces from the first film appear in this movie. So for a fan like myself, I was really happy to see that. And speaking of familiar faces, I'm sure a lot of you guys out there who had seen the trailer for the first time when it first had come out, that you were very surprised to see that Randy Watson and his band Sexual Chocolate would be making an appearance in this movie, along with Reverend Brown. And I'm sure a lot of you guys had lost your shit when you had saw that the barbershop guys along with the old Jewish man were going to be making an appearance in this movie. And in fact, in my opinion, I think those characters had the best scenes in the film. And I did not expect for those characters to be appearing in the film at all whatsoever, because I assumed that by this point they would be dead since they were so old in the first film. But no, they're still alive and kicking it, and they still have the same comedic charm that they had in the first film carried on to this movie. And that's one thing about this movie that I did appreciate when it came to the cameos, because a lot of the surprising cameos that we got in this film were coming from characters that I just did not expect at all whatsoever from the first movie. And one of those characters were the rapping twins from the first film. In fact, they perform a song with Sexual Chocolate at the end of the movie where they are performing that same rap song that they did in the first movie. And I'm sure many of you guys may remember the character of Amani, who was the original bride-to-be in the first film to Akeem. Well, she makes an appearance in this movie, and we come to learn that she is in fact the sister to the character that Wesley Snipes plays, I meant to say, in General Izzy. So we understand his motivation as far as why he's making these heavy threats to Akeem because of what happened in the events of the first film. And we also do get a bit of a happy closure for the character Namani, because the last time we saw her in the first film, she was literally hopping and barking. And then when you first see her in this movie, she's still doing the exact same things. Apparently she's traumatized or has some spell on her or something of that sort. And then after everything that had occurred between Izzy and the Jaffer family, everything gets resolved. And as a result of that, apparently Imani comes to and becomes normal again. So it was nice to see that there was a closure with this character that ended on a happy note. One of the major highlights for me is in Wesley Snipes. I think he's one of the best things about this movie. In fact, I think that every scene that he's in, he practically steals the scene. And I always forget how good of an actor Wesley Snipes really is, because in this film you definitely get to see more of his comedic chops, but it's not the first time he's done comedy. If you look at the movies, say for example like White Man Can't Jump, that's a great movie, and it's a really funny one at that too. But he's also a very, very good performer. When you look at a movie, say for example like To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, that movie is so fucking fantastic, but you really get to see a side of Snipes that you are not used to seeing at all whatsoever. And I don't think he's ever played a role like that ever since. But if you have not seen that movie, I recommend you go check out that film. I believe it's still on Netflix if I'm not mistaken, but it really is worth your time because he is so good in that movie along with Patrick Swayze and John Leguizamo. But anyways, I digress. But in this movie, you get to see a side of Snipes that shows that he is really good with comedy, and he really does very well and hanging with Eddie Murphy, who is one of the best comedic actors of all time, and in my opinion also one of the greatest actors of all time too. But you can definitely see that he is going nose to nose with Eddie, and he can definitely hang with him in that scene. And like I said before, I think in every scene that he's in, he practically steals a scene. I had mentioned earlier that I did like the story to this film, and that's still true, although I did have a lot of problems with it, which I'll be covering in my negatives. But as far as some of the story beats are concerned, the things that I appreciated the most was learning that Akeem, who in the first film was very like a revolutionist in a weird way, where he had wanted to get away from the traditional values that he had grown up in Zamunda, where he wanted to marry somebody of his choice, and he wanted that woman to love him and believe that change is part of tradition as well. And you could see that he was very much into setting up something new for not just himself and his new wife now, but rather for Zamunda. At least that's the impression that you get. And in this movie, you can still see that he's still very much that same nice guy who likes to look out for his family, look out for his friends. But you could also see that he is
starting to follow through with the old traditional values that were already established beforehand, and he seems very keen on trying to keep that now and honoring his father and his forefathers as well. And it's starting to become a problem where everyone else around him are starting to notice that these traditional values he's trying to hold on to are affecting them in a negative light, where they can't move forward, they can't grow and become who they really want to become and follow the dreams and so on, because there's a lot of restrictions in place that he never seemed to bother to removing. And seeing this change evolve for him by bringing his son in the picture to help remind him of these old traditional values don't make sense anymore, I thought that was very good. I thought it was done pretty effectively for the most part. And I do like the actor that played his son Lavelle in the film. I thought he was pretty good for the most part. And some of the other new characters as well, I thought worked pretty good. And one of the more surprising terms for me personally, which I wish we got more of, was the actress Shari Headley, who plays Lisa in the film. She is really good in this movie, and she has aged very well. And she has a really wonderful scene that involves herself and Akeem, where she's challenging his reasons for wanting to keep these traditional values, and then puts him in his spot. And I thought it was a very effective scene, and not just because she's showing that she's a strong woman, but that she had a lot of good reason for those arguments, and she was able to back it up, and I appreciated that in her. And it's unfortunate we don't get a whole lot of her in the movie, but when she's in the film, for the most part, she does have some sort of impact, but it's not until that one scene that happens towards the end of the film where you really felt her presence in the movie. But overall, I thought the story was pretty good, and I walked away pretty happy with it. And as I said before, it was a good watch for me personally. But now this is going to be the perfect segue to get into my negatives. And for anyone out there who has seen my review for the first Coming to America film, you'll know that my biggest problem with that movie was the accents that a lot of these actors were putting on in that first film did not do a good job in maintaining that accent. And in this movie, it's no different. In fact, I think Arsenio Hall has gotten a lot worse in trying to attempt to put on the accent, because he pretty much spoke with an American accent throughout the entirety of the film. Once in a while, the African accent would seep in, but for the most part, it was just non-existent. I do think that Eddie Murphy did do better this time around with keeping the accent, especially when he's in the scenes with Wesley Snipes, who in my opinion did it the best out of everybody. But for the most part, everybody else did their best, you can tell, to maintain its accent, but and then every once in a while the American accent would just seep right in, and then they'll revert right back to this African accent that they're attempting to put on. And one of the most common critiques that I've been hearing about this movie is that this is basically a beat for beat story that we've seen before in the first film, pretty much repeated again for this movie with a little bit of a different flair to it. And the original writers from the first film, in Barry W. Blaustein and also David Sheffield, they are back to write this movie as well. But this time around, I know that if I remember hearing correctly, that Eddie Murphy went out of his way to recruit Kenya Barris, who I'm sure many of you guys may be familiar with his work. The Netflix original series in Black AF is one of his shows that he helped create, and the other popular show in Blackish, which is another show that he runs as well. So I know that Eddie had brought Kenya into the mix here to add a much new, different flavor, so keep bringing more modernness to it to help tell this story. And I think that was a very smart attempt for him to do that, to add this new modern flair to it with all the familiar beats that everyone had loved about the first film, by bringing back the old writers to help make a whole new story. But the problem that I did have with the film in general was the fact that the development just did not work as well as it did in the first film, because when you see the relationship that is being developed between Lavelle and the royal groomer in the film, you do believe it. At least for me, I personally believed it, but I didn't connect to it as much as I did with Lisa and Akeem's relationship in the first film, because you see the trial and error that he has to go through to earn her love and earn her respect and earn her trust along the way as well. And in this movie, you definitely see that they're attempting with that, with a different twist to it, but I just didn't really connect with them in that sense at all. I'm not saying that I didn't like the characters and I didn't want the relationship to work out. I was happy to see that it did work out, but
it just didn't have that impact for me like the first one had done. And as I've already touched upon before about how this movie is basically the same story that we've seen before in the first film, and although I did enjoy the story for the most part, but I wish they had taken a different direction with the story, because this retelling of the same thing that we've seen before, I would have preferred them take the risk of doing something else entirely different with the story. In fact, if you think about the character of General Izzy played by Wesley Snipes, that story in itself could have been the entire movie. You already have the connection that they have with the first film, him being the brother to Imani, who was the original bride-to-be to Akeem in the first film. You have already something established there to connect with the first movie, especially since General Izzy is pretty much forcing Akeem to have his daughter marry his son. And you have those two nations pretty much butting heads with one another. You have an entire plot right there in itself that you can go with. And Akeem's son, Lavelle, played by Jermaine Fowler, truthfully, I really didn't care for that story at all, because we've already seen this before in the first film, and the character offered nothing new for me to connect with, and he was also nowhere near as interesting as Akeem in the first film. But that's not to take away that the character was not likable. He was a likable character, and for the most part I did enjoy his character, but it just was not enough for me to really connect with him at all. In fact, the other characters around him were much more interesting. For example, Akeem's oldest daughter, Princess Mika, her story was much more interesting. I would have preferred to focus more on that. And of course, the relationship, as I already mentioned before, between Akeem and General Izzy was way more interesting as well. So the focus on the story in itself, for me, wasn't the most interesting part. It was just all the other things surrounding the story that I thought helped make this film much more entertaining, that kept my attention. So with that being said, now we can get into the rating. Overall, I did enjoy the film. I still had a lot of fun with it, and I still found the film to be pretty funny. There's no doubt that the first film is the better movie, but when you compare this sequel to other sequels such as Dumb and Dumber 2 and Zoolander number 2, this film, as I mentioned earlier, is like The Godfather Part 2 in comparison to those sequels. But overall, I think there may be an audience out there that will come across this movie and still enjoy it for what it is. So, in my opinion, I say this film is definitely worth a shot. There are a lot of things about this movie that I just did not cover at all for this review, because there's just so much details to go over. One of the things I forgot to mention was that Leslie Jones and Tracy Morgan are in this movie, and I did think they were really good in the film. And I also forgot to mention about the other cameos in this movie, with Morgan Freeman being in the film. You also have Trevor Noah, Salt and Pepper, and In Vogue. And if you have seen the movie, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. Did you like and hate the film? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to our channel, and also share and like our videos, and hit that notification button down below. And follow our social media accounts. We have a Facebook and Instagram page at New Release Wednesdays, and you can follow us on Twitter at the NRW. And you can also follow me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, Rob_Medina0585, on Twitter, RobMedina0585, and on Facebook, simply just Rob the Movie Guy. And I hope you enjoyed the review, and I thank you very much for joining me here today. And until next time, cheers.